I'm here with Jeff Oberdorfer, sorry, and I'm Liz Cook, and we're going to talk about the heart of community design. So I want to introduce Jeff again for those of you who haven't met him. Jeff has supported many types of community and neighborhood gathering places, spaces, created visible solutions for livable streets, for communities, and has genuinely created an authentic community participation process. He's been instrumental in historical restorations and has worked in both small towns and urban planning. He's a pioneer in the integration of green vegetable roofs, what in urban settings is what is often called living roofs, and eco-friendly terrains such as regenerative water systems. And focusing on sustainable, affordable architecture is one of the main things that Jeff has done. He is socially responsible housing advocate. And he's developed the first set aside in California for developmentally disabled tenants. Jeff has initiated eco-passes programs to provide free transit and light rail and on-site childcare to those living in affordable housing. So he's really been comprehensive in his idea of what that means to create community. It speaks to his dedication to envisioning supportive community living and dynamic, inclusive public spaces. So as a lead fellow, last of all, Jeff has worked with concepts of cradle to cradle and green building responsibly sourced, and currently some new materials such as hemp. Jeff is nationally renowned consultant and advisor in multifamily affordable housing and social equity in design. So welcome, Jeff. It's good to be back with you.
It's good to see you.
Yeah. So we're going to talk, and I want to start with a quote because you said it in our last conversation, and I asked you to pause and for us to just think about what you were saying because it's very powerful, and I think it is at the heart of community design. If our environment, and you're speaking about man-made or human-made environment, affects us the way we know it does, then we have a right to participate in its design. So let's just start there. How do you define what it means to you to participate in community design or the design of our communities?
I think it means that people can work with professionals, whether it's an architect, landscape architect, urban designer, whatever. I'm talking now about the physical environment, towns, cities, buildings, and through an integrated process where people meet together in a consensus decision-making process, they come up with plans that are at the heart of what they're trying to do, whether it's building a new library or a town plan or a large building. Mm-hmm. That any kind of physical structure can have participation from the community.
And how is your approach different from what we often think of as called community input, like where people get to, go to their city council and complain about something that's about to be built, or challenge how it's being built, or where it's being built? That feels very different. It kind of feels like you're fighting something to stop it rather than actually participating in design.
Well, I think that the whole term community input's been so amazingly misused. And just like you said, it's often people coming to complain, even at a community meeting where the people there want to get input. Input basically is a one-directional system. Here's the problems I see. Here's what I like to see fixed. Here's traffic problems. Here's accidents that are happening. Those kinds of things. And input is very important. But it's only step one of a process that is then combined with the intimate knowledge the community has of their own spaces. And the way that I do this, and this has been something that I have evolved from a lot of other people who've done similar things. Like we've talked about this last time with Henry Sanoff, with Larry Halpern, But what I do is I start off by getting the input from people, writing it down, making sure we have it accurate. But then we take it to the next step, which is we hand out a questionnaire that says, please list your 3 favorite places and your 3 favorite experiences in the town that you live or the neighborhood you live. And then we might have 150 to 200 people at a workshop, and we collate the information that comes back from that. Now, some people call favorite places sacred spaces, but I like the word favorite better, but it's the same kind of idea. It's getting to the heart of what the community feels is crucial to their town. So for instance, we did one in Felton, which is a small town north of Santa Cruz. It's a kind of rural town in the Santa Cruz Mountains surrounded by redwoods. And the first thing that came up in people's favorite experiences was driving into this town, which is in a valley, from the hills above and seeing a little white community church, which was in fact a church that was now used as a library, a very small library, mostly for kids. And the library itself also came out as a favorite place. Now, when we presented this to the community, people said, aha, that's correct, but nobody had ever articulated it.
Mm.
So the fact that people came up with these issues, so for instance, views of the foothills, we were able to write a scenic view corridor guideline process that basically outlawed any buildings or structures that would block the view of that church. And these kind of scenic view corridors are really impossible to get approved, usually because people are afraid of losing their property rights. What if I wanted to build a 6-story building? Well, you can't if it blocks that view. So the fact that 150 to 200 people would come to the conclusion that the favorite experience they had was driving down the hill into the valley and seeing that church was so powerful that that image became an image of the Felton Town Plan. So what we do then is we take the people's input. We then do some pedestrian mapping where I have volunteers go out and for a half an hour in the morning and a half an hour in the evening, they map every pedestrian and where they're walking to. We then find out what the heaviest pedestrian corridors are, and we map that. So we map the pedestrian experiences that people map themselves with the favorite places on a map of the town. And then we put the view corridors in, which we already talked about, to protect those views, and that's a starting point. Then in most of the town plans I've done, we've had 150 to 200 people in large cafeterias. We break them up in teams of 6 to 8 people, and they're given a huge map of the downtown of Felton, see, for instance, and they have to come up with a consensus view amongst them of the kinds of things they'd like to see. We then have each group hang up their poster on the wall. There might be 10 or 15 of these, and each group presents their own consensus. We then take that back to my office and we see what's similar in each one of these plans, and we design a map that we bring to the next workshop that has the favorite places, the pedestrian mapping, and all the consensus decisions that people have made on one map. And then we have a list of those decisions that weren't consensus, but enough people had supported them that we have something substantial to talk about. The important thing about this is that rather than input, where people go to a meeting and complain mostly, or say what their wishes are, or they want better facilities for their children, or whatever it is, this takes the folks who've given the input and gives them the consensus process to develop their own town plan.
Mhm.
And when we get to the point after 3 or 4 workshops, we have a consensus plan for that town.
Mm.
And what then I do is I train 6 or 8 people who from the community will then give a presentation, in this case to the Board of Supervisors, but it could be a city council, and they present their own plan. I have nothing to do with it.
Oh, beautiful.
And the reason why that's really special is that when people design their own plan and they present it and they have that level of confidence, they're not going to let it go. It's not going to be a plan that sits on a shelf or waits for me or some other architect to come help them. They already have the tools and the skills to move ahead. Matter of fact, most often during processes like this, people who go through those workshops wind up being on the school board, the planning commission, the zoning board. They realize that they have the ability to make decisions about environmental planning that they've been intimidated to before.
Yes.
So when I first started doing this, and I hadn't had a lot of experience yet, I would stand in front of 60, 80 people, and I'd be introduced by the county supervisor or planning director or whatever. And the first thing that would happen is somebody would stand up and say, you know what? You're the expert. I don't want to sit down and go through this process. I want you to tell us what it is that we should do.
Mhm.
So the first time or the second time this happened to me, I didn't know what to say. I started explaining the rationale for community participation, which I realized was a mistake. But after I waited for a while at the next workshop, there was kind of a silence after this person stood up and said, "You're the expert, you do it." And all of a sudden, 3 or 4 people got up from the audience and they said, "No, it's our town. We want to participate." And they basically had the other person quieted down.
Mhm.
As a facilitator, I couldn't do that. It can only come from the community. So
Mm.
it's important that the community knows their rights, but also they need to know that as the facilitator, I'm working for them,
Mhm.
not the city, not the county. And that's a tough one for elected officials, planners to get used to. But that confidence that I would be representing them in an honest way is really, really important to the workshop process.
Yes. Yes. Well, that was where I was going to go next. I was going to say, what's at the heart of genuine participation? And you've just shared that is confidence, right? Confidence and a kind of feeling that this is our community. Why wouldn't we want to participate, right? Why?
Well, I think people think they don't have the technical skills. Like, why are you sitting there as an architect and letting us tell you what needs to happen? Well, it's because it's your community, it's not mine. And there are certain instances where it's really important for the community to understand their own power. And going back to the Felton Town plan, after a couple of workshops, we showed up with a plan of downtown Felton, which is a one-way street that basically follows the center of the valley all the way up to Silicon Valley. And we put street trees up and down the street, emphasizing that linear movement northbound towards the other villages in the mountains. And we presented this to the community, and they hated it.
Mhm.
And I mean, hated it. There wasn't anybody who thought it was a good idea. There was like 100, 150 people there. I'm thinking, I have to find out what's going on. So I started asking probing questions, and we talked about it 10, 15 minutes, and we're getting nowhere. Just that people were just vehement how much they disliked it. And finally, somebody got up and they said, "This is a Western town. We like things spread out, not linear. So instead of having a plan that was north south that followed the highway up through the valley, we developed a plan that was east-west instead of north-south that connected the historic Felton Covered Bridge with the downtown, with all the areas that we had mapped out as favorite places. And that was immediately accepted.
Right.
So I had no idea about this ever, because in a streetscape plan, you almost always follow the street with trees.
Mhm.
But what people were saying is, no, we like the wide open spaces. That's why we live here. We don't want it to be linear. We want it to be wide open and rural and Western.
Mhm.
And it took a while, but with me probing and said, what's going on? What are you thinking? Finally, somebody articulated it. And everybody went, that's it. That's exactly it. And that changed my whole impression of doing town plans
Mhm.
because of my assumptions as an architect that the way you do street trees is line up along the street. Even if it's not in the perfect linear row, you might move them in and out. But this was just saying, no, that's not what we want.
Well, and the horizontal plan actually gave it more of a sense of this is a town. This is a container, so to speak, of many people who share this. It's not just a place that you stop off on your way either to the beach or to Silicon Valley. It's there's that kind of floodplain of all things that are about the community itself.
That's right. That's right. And like most small towns, it follows the river.
Yeah.
So the river is right behind it. Next to the river is the Felton Covered Bridge, the tallest covered bridge in the United States, major tourist attraction. People love that bridge. So the symbols of Felton are always the Felton Covered Bridge and the church that was identified in the favorite places.
Mhm.
So by going basically, obviously, is horizontally instead of vertically, we connected the favorite place of the church with the favorite place of the Felton Covered Bridge, linking it through the downtown, putting a large deck around one of the heritage redwood trees that was a favorite place as well.
Mhm.
So basically, the information that people gave me that I had no idea of before I started became the focus of the Felton Town Plan. And the reason that people could articulate it is because they saw the process evolve and they saw their experiences and values put into the plan. So that's a lot different than input. It's a certain kind of input, but it's a more creative input that is not just you lining up in front of a 5 or 6 county supervisors and they're up on this podium and you're down at the microphone. And it doesn't matter. You could have 600 people show up complaining about something and maybe the solution won't come out of it.
Yeah.
So what's important about community participation is the people who live there are the people who know how to solve the problem. They don't have the confidence to solve it because they've been told that only planners can do that.
Right. Right.
So,
Yeah, and so they don't take the authority of having literally lived there, know what they like, but also know what works. Like like you just said, like you might look at it a certain way, but when you're walking that town, and that town does have a horse stables, and people literally ride into town, and so like what people do in the town who live there, not who visit there, but who live there.
mhm,
Yeah.
that's right. That's right. And people love living there,
Mhm.
so that has to be honored.
Absolutely. Yeah. So your role then, it seems, is to build this confidence, to get and to help them articulate, and that's partly a visual process, right? As well as a verbal process of like what is our favorite places, but then also starting to see them on some visual, like you said, a drawing where people can really come together and start talking about what is important to them. So there's a dialogue there going on with the community that may not happen if they were just talking to each other on the street.
No, because the role of the architect in my experience, whether it's an architect, urban designer, landscape architect, is that the focus is on the physical nature of the town. So you need somebody professionally who knows how to do that.
Mhm.
but needs the feedback from the client, who are the 200 people at the workshop.
Mhm.
Um, and I'm basically an ally of that process.
Yes.
So people can agree or disagree with me, but when the plan's finished, people can point to something and say, that came from my table.
Mhm. They can take some
Now,
pride in being having actually participated.
they have ownership.
Mhm.
And that means that if the plan now is 30 years old and people still talk about the Felton Town plan and things still pop up that the plan proposed years ago that now are happening in increments.
Mm.
As the money comes through, as people start realizing some of the connections they want, as new businesses move in, the town becomes a little bit more sophisticated.
Mhm.
And it's true in any town plan I've ever done, or when I did neighborhood traffic management, it was the same thing, is that when people's needs are honored and their input is pushed to a creative place,
Yes,
that's when things click.
it's beautiful. So, um, give your listeners another example of community of this the heart of community design. So something else that you've done many things, but tell another story about where that you really felt that heart. How it really ignited something in the community. You mentioned
Well, I
one.
think I was asked by a neighborhood group to work with them on traffic issues in downtown Santa Cruz,
Mhm.
and the city was not interested. Matter of fact, this was the 1980s, so the city was pretty much public works ran the streets, and you weren't allowed to say anything because they right away say it's a safety issue. That's changed drastically over the past 30 years, and now, especially after the pandemic, with people taking over streets in their neighborhoods and in downtowns, with either parking spaces turned into outdoor dining, or what they now call slow streets, or whatever. When we first did this, it was based on the work of Donald Appleyard, who is an urban designer from San Francisco. And he had done a street livability study funded by the planning department in San Francisco, where he showed that as streets became more and more heavily trafficked and the noise got more and more, that you'd find people putting up fences and keeping their windows closed, and the neighborhood eyes on the street disappeared. So
Mm.
this was the street livability study, and he used and at the same time, the Wunderf from Denmark was becoming popular in the United States. The Wunderf is a residential street where the hierarchy of the street is for the pedestrian, not the car. So there's a different speed limit. The texture of the street is usually with some really nice textured pavement, not concrete. The street's narrower, and the pedestrian has the right of way. It was called a Wunderf. And this became something that was really interesting to people in the United States. So at the same time this was happening, and Appleyard had done his study, I was retained by a neighborhood group to do the plan for downtown Santa Cruz. So this became a rallying point for the neighborhood because they felt that their neighborhood was being kind of divided by traffic. And we wound up doing a series of one-way streets and S-curves and chokers and other kinds of things to slow traffic down. We actually had the fire trucks come out and make sure they could turn the streets where we had bulbed it out,
Mhm.
and they found out they could. And it became extremely political because the Public Works Department was against it. They didn't want anybody to do anything in their street. And they got all the utilities to be against it. But it became such a popular issue that progressive people were elected to office and basically went through with it and installed it. And it's still there now, 30 years later. And we called it livable streets, neighborhood traffic calming. Now it's called road diet or slow streets, but it's the same principle and it's coming back because of the pandemic. Because people now, when they see the streets narrowed or turns into slow streets, or because of the lack of traffic because of COVID, they start realizing that they could own those streets. And the streets are 30% of the land area in an urban environment.
Yeah.
So that is really powerful because people were able to visualize the same street before and after the pandemic with parking spaces taken out and cafes put outside in where was the parking space. And they saw the street choked down and it became safer for bicycles and safer for pedestrians.
Yeah.
So when people can visualize something, even there's no facilitator involved, there was no facilitator on slow streets, they became really aware of what could happen, for instance, in San Jose with more bicycle lanes,
Hmm.
because they understood the power that the streets held that they weren't allowed to access until recently.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
And that's happening throughout the United States.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and that sense of community is returned to the people who live there. Neighbors are out, kids are out, there's less noise and more interaction.
Well, also, business owners are realizing that it's more important to have their customers outside in a parking space than a car.
That's right.
And people say that in urban design, it's people who shop, not cars.
Yeah,
And we've become accustomed to, no, we need that car right in front of the business,
right.
and that's no longer the case.
Mhm.
If the streets are walkable and interesting, you park 2 blocks away, or take a bus, or ride your bike, or walk.
Yeah,
And that's happening now throughout the United States. People are very excited about that.
yeah, yeah. And you've been doing it for years. The 1980s that was happening. Yeah.
Yeah, 1985, around that, we did Livable Streets. And I wound up doing a couple of others after that with circulation plans that took in the same kind of criteria throughout. I was hired in Santa Monica by a neighborhood group to look at the pedestrian safety on Montana Avenue, one of the most, elite residential and retail streets in the area.
Mhm.
And originally, the planning department didn't want to hear about it. But once we started drawing up some of the issues, the planning department said, that's really amazing. You're going to really cut down on pedestrian accidents with cars. And the business people liked it.
Yeah.
And those were installed 20 or 30 years ago. I did the same thing for the town of Los Gatos, just north of Santa Cruz, where we did that. Very simple techniques to make it safer for people.
Yes. Yes. So, um, the last question or proposal I have is to kind of tell us over the years what you've heard from people who have participated. Like in the moment, you can tell they feel empowered, they feel good. But you know, uh, when people take over a process, like you did a participatory process for a library, and what people really wanted in that library, or any of your stories of where what did you hear about people? What did they tell you about what it was like for them to participate?
Almost always they have a tremendous affection for the process and a memory of the process and what their role was in it.
Hmm.
And I did the participation process for the Boulder Creek Library
Hmm.
with Peter Calthorpe. And it was really interesting because I went to the 35th anniversary of it a couple of years ago, and the librarians hate it, which is really interesting because they're still angry at me 35 years later. But the reason was that this happened, the branch library happened in Boulder Creek, which is 6 miles north of Felton. And it's again a rural town And Highway 9 connects these three towns through the San Lorenzo Valley. And in really bad weather, these communities, these villages of Ben Lomond, Boulder Creek, and Felton, you can't get out of them.
Hmm.
You know, if a street gets flooded, they're roadblocked. They're blocked in.
Yep.
So one of the things that came out of the library community process was we want a home away from home. We want some place where there's an emergency, and this was supported by the county supervisor, also an architect, and they wanted to be able to have 30 or 40 people gather there and be warm and have food. And it was more than a library.
Right.
And actually, many libraries around the country are coming around to that now, where
Right.
libraries are lending out lawnmowers and all kinds of things.
Right.
But one of the principles of library design, and it's the same as nursing station design or any focus point, is they want the librarian to see everything that's happening, or else they have to have two librarians to really view everything. And the way the library was designed didn't allow that. The site wouldn't allow that. And also, we had a wood burning stove.
Mm.
Well, that's a no-no in library design, at least then.
Mhm.
And we have chopped wood in there and a stove, and they keep the stove running in the winter when it gets really cold, which it's not this winter. But so it's really thought about really as a community retreat building in case of emergencies, not just a library. It's both functions. And the librarians didn't like that. And I think
What
librarians,
didn't they like about it? What was the thing they felt
well, wood burning stove is a
is
no-no
scary?
because
Yeah, that was
it's
scary.
scary, it's dangerous, you know.
Other people can put wood in it.
Yeah, it's also extremely warm and wonderful on
Uh-huh.
a cold day.
Yeah.
Um,
No, it's a
so
gorgeous library. It's a
that was, they didn't like that, and they didn't like the lack of sight distance. And so when I gave the 35th anniversary slideshow, and I showed, and this was in the library amphitheater, and I showed images of the first sketches people had done of window boxes where people could sit and relax. And we did that right next to the window box that was designed based on that sketch.
Mhm.
And I brought up the fact that the librarian still didn't like it. And the librarian was there, not the original librarian, but she was there and she was shaking her head. But I think it was the first time somebody explained what the rationale was for this building.
Mhm.
And it went on to win National Library Awards, but more for Peter Calthorpe, who did a great job designing the building. But
Yeah, it's a
so I think that people love that building.
they do.
You know, there's tremendous affection for that building, and the fact that it was designed based on their feedback and the needs of the community, and not just the library staff.
Yeah. The real heart of the community is that what is one of the things is that library is it brings it's a place to come together.
It
And
is.
a lot of people live up, in isolated areas and libraries have become that. They've even, hired clinical social workers or therapists there to help people kind of, it's become a really place of community gathering, children, adults, and,
That's
elders.
right. I was just reading that I think it was in Denmark. When you go to a library, you can rent a person for a half an hour
Oh, yeah, yeah,
and
in which to have a
just
conversation.
just have a conversation.
Yeah.
So libraries are changing. You know, we think about the technology, but they're also changing to be more human and community oriented.
Yeah, yeah, that's wonderful. That's fabulous. Well, thank you. Anything else you want to tell us to kind of sum up this piece of the heart of community design? I mean, most of everything you do is very community oriented, and we will cover some other areas about all the different ways you've worked with, for example, multifamily affordable housing and how that creates community. But in this just kind of overview of the heart
Well,
of
I think it's important for people to understand, even people who mean well, that having people line up and complain about issues in their community isn't taking the process far enough where the people sit down with a professional and work out the problems themselves, and
Yeah.
then go back to the Board of Supervisors or the City Council and present the way they decided to solve their problems and what their vision is for their community or their library or their park or whatever.
Mhm.
That I think that people need to understand that. And there's a lot of good people doing community input, but it doesn't go far enough.
Yes.
And there's even places like I know when Boston was doing this huge public process. It took several years, and it was most of it done on the computer because there's thousands of people. I still think that you take a representative number of those people and sit them down face to face, making sure it represents everybody who's involved, and have them work through the issues themselves in a consensus decision-making process.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Jeff. This was great
Great, thanks, Liz.
conversation. And well, there's more to come.
More to come.